Which two components are created in an Azure subscription? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What is an Azure storage account named Storage001 an example of? For which resource does Azure generate separate billing reports and invoices by default? Which resource can you use to manage access, policies, and compliance across multiple subscriptions? Answer choice is the deployment and management service for Azure. What can you use to execute code in a serverless environment? Azure Functions allows you to run code as a service without having to manage the underlying platform or infrastructure. Azure Logic Apps is similar to Azure Functions, but uses predefined workflows instead of developing your own code. Azure Functions allows you to run code as a service without having to manage the underlying platform or infrastructure. Azure Logic Apps is similar to Azure Functions, but uses predefined workflows instead of developing your own code. You need to allow resources on two different Azure virtual networks to communicate with each other. What should you configure? Which two services can you use to establish network connectivity between an on-premises network and Azure resources? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What can you use to provide Mac and Android users with access to a Windows environment that will run Windows-based applications? What can you use to provide Mac and Android users with access to a Windows environment that will run Windows-based applications? What are two services that allow you to run applications in containers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which storage service offers fully managed file shares in the cloud that are accessible by using Server Message Block (SMB) protocol? Which Azure storage service should you use to store unstructured files, such as images, that will be served on web pages? Which two protocols are used to access Azure file shares? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What enables a user to sign in one time and use that credential to access multiple resources and applications from different providers? What can you use to allow a user to manage all the resources in a resource group? Which type of strategy uses a series of mechanisms to slow the advancement of an attack that aims to gain unauthorized access to data? Which type of strategy uses a series of mechanisms to slow the advancement of an attack that aims to gain unauthorized access to data? What Azure AD feature can you use to configure security authentication that requires users to use their mobile phone to sign in? Which two services are provided by Azure AD? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What Azure AD feature can you use to ensure that users can only access Microsoft Office 365 applications from approved client applications? Which two attributes are characteristics of the private cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What are two characteristics of the public cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Refers to upfront costs incurred one time, such as hardware purchases. Which cloud deployment model are you using if you have servers physically located at your organization's on-site data center, and you migrate a few of the servers to the cloud? Deploying and configuring cloud-based resources quickly as business requirements change is called answer choice. Deploying and configuring cloud-based resources quickly as business requirements change is called answer choice. Agility means that you can deploy and configure cloud-based resources quickly as app requirements change. Scalability means that you can add RAM, CPU, or entire virtual machines to a configuration. Elasticity means that you can configure cloud-based apps to take advantage of auto-scaling, so apps always have the resources they need. High availability means that cloud-based apps can provide a continuous user experience with no apparent downtime, even when things go wrong. Agility means that you can deploy and configure cloud-based resources quickly as app requirements change. Agility means that you can deploy and configure cloud-based resources quickly as app requirements change. Increasing compute capacity for an app by adding instances of resources such as virtual machines is called answer choice. What is high availability in a public cloud environment dependent on? An example of answer choice is automatically scaling an application to ensure that the application has the resources needed to meet customer demands. Which cloud service model provides you with the most control over the hardware that runs applications? Which type of cloud service model is typically licensed through a monthly or annual subscription? You need to focus on application development rather than configuration and management of servers. Which cloud service model should you use? You need to compare the costs of running an application in an on-premises data center with the costs of running the application in Azure. Which two scenarios are common billing use cases for resource tags? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. You plan to build a new solution in Azure that will use Platform as a Service, PaaS, products. What should you use to estimate the monthly costs? What can you use to ensure that new and existing Azure resources stay in compliance with corporate standards? You need to identify which Azure services are compliant with ISO 27001 information security management standards. What can you use to restrict the deployment of a virtual machine to a specific location? Which two actions can be performed by using the Graphical User Interface, GUI, in the Azure portal? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. The Azure portal provides a GUI to view all the services you are using, create new services, configure your services, and view reports. The Azure portal provides a GUI to view all the services you are using, create new services, configure your services, and view reports. Which two actions can be performed by using the Graphical User Interface, GUI, in the Azure portal? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What can you use to define the resources you want to provision in a declarative JSON format? Which management layer accepts requests from any Azure tool or API and enables you to create, update, and delete resources in an Azure account? Which two tools are accessible via Azure Cloud Shell and allows you to write Bash scripts to manage an Azure environment? What should you use to access Azure Cloud Shell? What provides recommendations to reduce the cost of Azure resources? Which Azure service evaluates Azure resources and makes recommendations to help improve reliability, security, performance, and cost reduction? You need to be notified when there are new recommendations for reducing Azure costs. Which tool should you use? You need to create a custom solution that uses thresholds to trigger auto-scaling functionality to scale an app up or down to meet user demand. What should you include in the solution? What can you use to get notification about an outage in a specific Azure region? Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. Answer choice is the logical container used to combine and organize Azure resources. In a region pair, a region is paired with another region in the same answer choice. Which two components are created in an Azure subscription? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What is an Azure storage account named Storage 001 an example of? For which resource does Azure generate separate billing reports and invoices by default? Which resource can you use to manage access, policies, and compliance across multiple subscriptions? Answer choice is the deployment and management service for Azure. Which Azure resource is a software emulation of a physical computer that includes a virtual processor, memory, storage, and what can you use to connect Azure resources, such as Azure SQL databases, to an Azure virtual network? What can you use to provide Mac and Android users with access to a Windows environment that will run Windows-based applications? What are two services that allow you to run applications in containers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which Azure Blob storage tier stores data offline and offers the lowest storage costs and the highest costs to access data? Which two scenarios are common use cases for Azure Blob storage? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two scenarios are common use cases for Azure Blob storage? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two scenarios are common use cases for Azure Blob storage? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which Azure storage service should you use to store unstructured files, such as images, that will be served on web pages? What can you use to ensure that a user can only access applications from compliant devices? What can you use to allow a user to manage all the resources in a resource group? Which two services are provided by Azure AD? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two services are provided by Azure AD? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two services are provided by Azure AD? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What can you use to sync identities from an on-premises Active Directory Domain Services, ADDS, domain to Azure AD? What can you use to ensure that users authenticate by using multi-factor authentication, MFA, when they attempt to sign in from a specific location? Which two factors affect Azure costs? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two features are available by using Azure Cost Management and Billing? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. You need to associate the costs of resources to different groups within an organization without changing the location of the resources. What should you use? You need to ensure that multi-factor authentication, MFA, is enabled on accounts with right permissions in an Azure subscription. What should you implement? You need to ensure that multi-factor authentication, MFA, is enabled on accounts with right permissions in an Azure subscription. What should you implement? You need to ensure that multi-factor authentication, MFA, is enabled on accounts with right permissions in an Azure subscription. What should you implement? What can you use to restrict the deployment of a virtual machine to a specific location? What can you use to ensure that a development team can only create virtual machines of a certain size? Which two actions can be performed by using the Graphical User Interface, GUI, in the Azure portal? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What can you use to create resources in Azure and includes a validation step to ensure all resources are created in a specific order based on dependencies, which Azure service evaluates Azure resources and makes recommendations to help improve reliability, security, performance, and cost reduction. You need to be notified when there are new recommendations for reducing Azure costs. Which tool should you use? You need to create a custom solution that uses thresholds to trigger auto-scaling functionality to scale an app up or down to meet user demand. What should you include in the solution? What should you proactively review and act on to avoid service interruptions, such as service retirements and breaking changes? What can you use to automatically detect performance anomalies for web apps? Which Azure service can generate an alert if virtual machine utilization is over 80% for 5 minutes? What can you use to find information about planned maintenance for Azure services that are critical to your organization? Which two attributes are characteristics of the private cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What are two basic services provided by all cloud providers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Which two characteristics are common advantages of cloud computing? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What is an advantage of cloud computing compared to on-premises deployments? Which cloud service model provides you with the most control over the hardware that runs applications? What is the customer responsible for in a software as a service, SaaS, model? Your organization is building a custom application. You need to focus on application development rather than configuration and management of servers. Which cloud service model is used by Azure SQL database? What uses the infrastructure as a service, IaaS, cloud service model? Which type of cloud service are virtual networks? Which two attributes are characteristics of the private cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What are two basic services provided by all cloud providers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. What are two characteristics of the public cloud deployment model? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Why is cloud computing often less expensive than on-premises data centers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Answer choice refers to upfront costs incurred one time, such as hardware purchases. Which cloud deployment model are you using if you have servers physically located at your organization's on-site data center, and you migrate a few of the servers to the cloud? Select the answer that correctly completes the sentence. Increasing compute capacity for an app by deploying and configuring cloud-based resources quickly as business requirements change is called answer choice. Deploying and configuring cloud-based resources quickly as business requirements change is called answer choice. Increasing compute capacity for an app by adding instances of resources such as virtual. An example of answer choice is automatically scaling an application to ensure that the application has the resources needed to meet customer demands. An example of answer choice is automatically scaling an application to ensure that the application has the resources needed to meet customer demands. In cloud computing, answer choice allows you to deploy applications to regional data centers around the world. You need to allow resources on two different Azure virtual networks to communicate with each other. What should you configure? You need to allow resources on two different Azure virtual networks to communicate with each other. What should you configure? You can link virtual networks together by using virtual network peering. Peering enables resources in each virtual network to communicate with each other. What are two services that allow you to run applications in containers? Each correct answer presents a complete solution.
Because often we want some kind of persistent storage. So great, we've got these various compute services that we're going to build on top of. We have those networking concepts, but hey, I need to store stuff. So how do we think about that? Let's come over here. So the most basic building block we have when we think about storage is a storage account. And nearly every other type of storage we see in some way builds on top of that. Now, a storage account has a number of different attributes. It has a name. It lives within a specific region. And one of the big configurations we do is we have a certain redundancy. Remember we talked about, so it lives in a certain region. So if it lives in a certain region, remember, many regions expose the idea of availability zones to us. So we have that idea within the region of kind of that AZ 1, 2, and 3. And then we also talked about paired regions. So there's also the paired region, hundreds of miles away, but in the same geopolitical boundary. And it has data centers, and we really only care about one of them in this case. So when I create a storage account, I pick the type of resiliency I want. So the first option is we have LRS. Now there's always 3 copies of the data, but those 3 copies are within the same cluster. So those 3 copies basically live in the same data center. Then we have zone redundant. So that's locally redundant, so there's always 3. Then we have zone redundant, where there's 3 again, but now those 3 are spread over the 3 AZs within the region. Then we have the concept of GRS. So GRS, there's 3, and then we have another 3 in the paired region. So I could have kind of 3 in this AZ, and then 3 over here as well. Then there's a combination GZRS. So that's 3, and then 3, but this time with GZRS, it's a combination of ZRS and GRS. So the 3 are distributed over 3 AZs in the primary, but then you have the 3 in the same data center over there. And whenever it replicates over, that is always asynchronous. So it's because of the latency, it will slow down performance. There's always an asynchronous replication. You may also see, for some of them, there is an RA kind of variant. And what the RA, like GRS or RA GZRS does is for certain services, you can read from that pair. Not all services support that, but that is available for some of them. Also, the different resiliency options vary depending on the type, the performance of my storage account. Because we have standard performance, so with standard, all of these options are available. Again, ZRS may not be available if the region doesn't support availability zones. But if I do the premium, well, the premium options, they never have the geo-redundant. It may not even have the ZRS option. It varies depending on the type. If we want to look to a storage account really, really quickly over here, we can actually see that in action. So if I go home, if I look at my storage accounts, and I go to create a new storage account, you'll see we have the same things about creating we select a resource group, we give it a name, but under performance, hey, it's currently standard. So with standard, I have all of the options, LRS, GRS, ZRS, and GZRS. And notice you have that option to make read access to data available. So that's that RA option. But if I change this to premium, notice I only have LRS, that's for page blobs, but block blobs, I have LRS and ZRS, and files, I have LRS and ZRS as well. But with premium performance, I never have a geo-replicated option. So if I'm talking about that premium and standard, so what is that all about? We notice with premium, I had to pick a certain type of service. So in addition to this idea of region and redundancy, we have different services or types that are available. So we have blob, a binary large object. And we have block blob that is made up of blocks. We have page blob, which is made up of pages. It's very good for read, write over random areas, i.e. like an operating system disk. And then there is append, very good for like logging. I just need to add to the end of that. So with a block blob, they kind of are stored in containers. That's the structure, but it's flat. There's no true folders. There's an idea that you have virtual directories by putting a folder as part of the name of the file, but it's not a true directory structure. There is actually on top of block, you can add Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. That actually adds capabilities like POSIX style ACLs and a hierarchical file system. So it actually gets true like folders. I actually get real folders as part of that. There's other features, but that's like a true data lake. When we think about page blobs, well, remember in that compute, when I listed the compute provider, well, we have disks. So let's draw out a different color. So disks, actually behind the scenes, are using a page blob sitting on a storage account, but it abstracts it away completely. And disks are what we typically use with virtual machines and virtual machine scale sets and nodes and other types of durable storage. There are different types. You'll see things like standard hard disk drive, which are the cheapest and slowest performance, highest latencies. You'll see standard SSD. You'll see premium SSD. And then you'll see ultra disk. Ultra disk is unique in that things like the IOPS and the throughput characteristics are independently controllable and can be actually changed while it's being used. Whereas with premium and the standards, the performance scales linearly with the amount of capacity you add. So that's kind of a big difference between those. To be able to use the premium and the ultra, it must be kind of the S variant of the virtual machine. You'll see often there's something like a DS and ES and FS. That S means I can use the premium SSD and the ultra disk. So I have to have that variant to actually be able to use those. The other benefit disks add is I have things like images, I have snapshot capabilities. It makes it a true resource of the Azure rather than just being this page blob. Then there's things like files. So files gives me the option to actually have SMB or NFS shares. So I basically create a share of one of those types. Within that share, I can then put in my various files using SMB or NFS protocols. There is a solution that what this is basically doing is in Azure, I'm creating that file share in my storage account. What you can actually have is if I had file servers on premises running Windows Server, So I had traditional file servers. This thing called Azure File Sync. And what Azure File Sync does is it will actually, as the name suggests, synchronize on-premises file servers to that cloud share, the Azure file share. They all sync via the file share, never to each other directly. It can also tier data. So if there's data that is not used very frequently, it will actually remove it from the local copy and it's only stored here. But if someone tried to access it, it would pull it down on demand. So I have files as well, capabilities. There's also the ability to have queues. So small messages in a first in, first out format. It's normally used to drive maybe some kind of event-driven process. And then there's also tables. So tables is really about kind of key value, schema-less storage. And so all of those are available as part of a regular standard storage account. Remember, if I select Premium, well, with Premium, then I pick one of them. Remember, there was Premium Block Blob, Premium Page Blob, or Premium Files. That is only that type of service is supported. Another key point when I think about Block Blob, and actually Files has these capabilities as well, is sometimes you'll hear about access tiers. Because we have different ways we want to use a service. We have data we're constantly interacting with, data we maybe interact with less commonly, but we need it available instantly, data we need to keep, but we could wait for getting access to it. So we can always think about, well, there's like kind of that premium offering. We'll do premium in our super gold color. So often maybe for like Blob, and Files, I can create premium. But then outside of premium, if I just go to kind of my standard type account, then we have the option of a hot tier, a cool tier, and then we have, I guess we'll do archive tier. And the point is I pay more money for the capacity, the storage with the hot tier, but less for the transactions. And as we go down, we pay less for the storage, but more for the transactions. And archive is actually offline. I have to actually move it out of archive into hot or cool to be able to interact with the data. I can manually move these between them. Again, premium is a different type of storage account. I can't just move between it with an entire copy operation. But one of the things we have is lifecycle management. And what lifecycle management will do is based on rules I set. Hey, last time it was accessed, last time it was modified. Hey, move it from hot to cool. It's not being used very much, move it to cool. Hey, it's not being used at all, move it to archive. Hey, it's been 7 years, delete it. So this can help kind of automate those various things or even go and put it in the trash can. Or it was a dumpster fire, one of those things. So these access tiers are available for that. That's Block. Files does have a similar concept, but it doesn't have archive. It has transaction optimized, hot and cool. There's no offline archive option, but it is a similar kind of concept. Again, I can pay more for the storage because I'm interacting with it lots, so I pay less for the transactions. Or hey, I need to keep it online, but I don't expect to interact with it much, so I'll pay more for the transactions, but less for the actual storage. So that's like really basic, just hey, something to store stuff in. But often we need kind of a richer capability than that. I don't just want to store some blob or something else. So what we typically want are databases. And there are many different database technologies in Azure. Often we talk about a relational database. And I want the idea that, hey, we have data that is in some way structured in a schema way. I have a defined set of columns I can have with different types of data values. There are keys that specify the uniqueness and how maybe different tables relate to one another. I normalize the data, so maybe I have addresses in one table, orders in another table, customers in another table, inventory in another table. It avoids duplication, and it's just focused on certain types of data. Now, when I think about in Azure, there are many types of database service. Yes, I could run it in a VM. Remember the responsibility. I don't want to be responsible for the OS. Maybe I don't even want to be responsible for the database. So there are solutions that are based on SQL. So SQL is Microsoft's solution. So one of the things we have here is we have Azure SQL Database. So this is kind of the most PaaS type solution. Now, they're all PaaS solutions really, but this is fully managed offering. There are different SKUs available. There's things like hyperscale, which is this massive scale set of capabilities with separated page servers that scale out for the storage. There's a serverless offering. There's regular SKUs. There's standard. There's business critical. But this is a true PaaS. Hey, I'm deploying this service in the cloud. I'll use Azure SQL Database. But maybe I'm actually moving a SQL database from on-prem to the cloud, and I need some existing type features that don't work with this Azure SQL database. I'm using the maybe common language runtime. I have cross-database queries. I need to use a SQL Server agent. So then what we have is Azure SQL Managed Instance, MI. So this is all about compatibility. There's a whole bunch of different features that we can quickly kind of look at. And what we'll see is if we compare this against Azure SQL Database on the left and Azure SQL Managed Instance, you'll see a whole lot more yeses on this right-hand column. Things like common language runtime, yes, I can do that with Azure SQL Managed Instance. Cross-database queries, cross-database transactions, database mail, yes. Different types of statements, yes. Distributed partition views, yes. It's about a better compatibility. It actually deploys into my virtual network in Azure as well. And so if I'm looking for, hey, I'm moving a database from on-premises to Azure, I'm using certain features that, hey, I don't think are going to be a fit, Azure SQL MI deploys into my VNet, and it has great compatibility. And there's things like the migration data service that will help me both ascertain how I'm using things on-prem, what features I'm using, to actually then get it into these types of service. Now, there's also ones that are built on top of open source software. So things like Postgres, MySQL. There is Azure Database for these. So it's completely managed offerings of these, but it's built on that open source software. So if I'm currently using these solutions on-prem, hey, I can go to a fully managed version actually running in Azure. It has native backup, native high availability, different scaling options, full monitoring, and hey, I can just go and leverage these. There's also a Postgres hyperscale offering. So this uses the Citus extension to give me that sharding of the data over multiple servers and get that huge scale, huge performance. And then I can think about, well, okay, I just have this idea of kind of born in the cloud. which is Cosmos DB. So Cosmos DB is all about multiple models. And when I talk about multiple models, I'm talking about things like, hey, I can have documents, so I can store JSON documents. I'm using SQL or MongoDB APIs. I could have column-based data, so Cassandra. I have key value. I have graph. I can use a Gremlin API. So there's multiple models of data that we can have with this. And I can pick the consistency. Often with databases, there's a single primary, a read-write. And anything in another region will be a read replica. With Cosmos DB, I get to pick that consistency. And although you don't need to really understand the full detail about this, if we just go and look, one of the nice things I can do here is if I go and look at Cosmos DB, you get to pick the consistency. So I could have an instance of a database in every single region, and I get to pick how is it going to handle keeping those different copies in sync. I could have strong, where they would all have the same data. So that means, hey, I'd have to wait for it to go everywhere before it's acknowledged. But there's, hey, I just need to be consistent within a particular session, but I'm guaranteed ordering and consistency between them. Eventual, hey, it may get data out of order, but that doesn't matter. It'll get it eventually, and there's kind of ones in between. But that's a very flexible solution depending on what I actually want to do. Now, I talked about VMs, and actually while I'm in the screen, there's something called the Azure Marketplace. And as the name suggests, it's a place where I can easily see resources. But not just those from Microsoft, third parties, for example, networking, there's a whole bunch of networking solutions. I could go and see more in the marketplace and see all the different types of solutions. Now, these could be VMs that have certain software pre-configured on them, and I can just use it. Sometimes they include the licensing as a pay-as-you-go. Sometimes you bring your own license with it, so it totally varies. Maybe it uses another type of Azure resource. But there's all these different types of things available. So if I want to stand something up in Azure, often we can just head over to that marketplace, and there'll be something there that I can actually leverage. So that kind of sits and makes all these different things available. Okay, so let's move on to other types of service. So we drew this idea of these like core compute things. So this is all about me writing my app, and then I can run my app on these things. But sometimes there's kind of higher solutions and that there's services that actually do something for me. Internet of Things is kind of this huge popular thing right now. The idea that you have all these little devices, and all these little miniature devices have these micro kind of controller units in them, and they connect to the network. Now, if you have things connecting to the network, there's pros and cons with that. I can now send data, I can send metrics, I can send events to something. I can also now receive updates, a firmware update, a software update. But also, if I'm connected, bad people can try and do things to it. So with this Internet of Things and all these internet-enabled devices, so this IoT, where everything can have a sensor, it thinks about, hey, it sends data out, but it also needs to maybe receive instructions, maybe updates, actions it needs to do. And so if I think about just that basic interaction with that device, well, there's services to do that. So the first service we think about is Azure IoT Hub. So Azure IoT Hub is all about that ability to have devices basically register and be known as devices to this service. It enables me via SDKs that it provides to then write my app to talk and receive via those SDKs. So it's doing the work to understand the direct communications. It has like a digital version of all of those devices. So it has a device twin that represents the device that I can talk to get information from and send instructions to that it will then pass on the device when it's next online. So this is all about the capability to manage all of those devices and have them registered with something, but I'm going to write the app to actually go and do the work. So yes, I could push firmware updates, I can get telemetry, I can get sensor readings and all of those things, but I just need something to provide the connectivity. I am going to write the work that actually does the solution. Maybe I want something a bit more. So then the next option we actually have over here is Azure IoT Central. Now, this is essentially sitting on top of Azure IoT Hub, but this is adding nice things like dashboards. It has a whole set of industry-based sets of solutions and scenarios like retail and government and energy and healthcare that provides me that complete set of information and simulated devices so I can start getting up and running super, super quickly. I can customize the user interface. I can have rules via a nice graphical wizard based on some kind of telemetry or information I get to do something. I can call a logic app, that serverless thing we talked about. I can send an email. For example, maybe I'm talking to devices. If a temperature reading goes above X, I maybe it's going to start thawing out. Call this logic app or send an email to someone. And I can do it all through these nice graphical interfaces. So IoT Hub is about, hey, I want to write something to do the logic and the work, but I need something to deal with the talking to the devices. Azure IoT Central is about, hey, I want something out of the box that I can then just customize the dashboards and the management. The next solution is Azure Sphere. And Azure Sphere is really focused around the idea of securing the devices. There's three key components to it. This microcontroller unit, well, there's really this Azure Sphere license set of technology. And that's going to